The Arabella was advancing now along a course which, if continued, must carry her straight between the two Spanish ships. My lord pointed it out. "He's crazy, surely," he cried. "He's driving straight into a death trap. He'll be crushed to splinters between the two. No wonder that black-faced Don is holding his fire. In his place, I should do the same." But even at that moment the admiral raised his hand. In the waist below him a trumpet blared, and immediately the gunner on the prow touched off his guns. As the thunder of them rolled out, his lordship saw ahead of beyond the English ship, and to the larboard of her two heavy splashes. Almost at once two successive spurts of flame leapt from the brass cannon on the Arabella's beakhead, and scarcely had the watchers on the poop seen the shower of spray, where one of the shots struck the water near them. Then, with a rending crash and a shiver that shook the Milagrosa from stem to stern, the other came to lodge in her forecastle. To avenge that blow, the Hilgada blazed at the Englishman with both her forward guns, but even at that short range, between 200 and 300 yards, neither shot took effect. At 100 yards, the Arabella's forward guns, which had meanwhile been reloaded, fired again at the Milagrosa, and this time smashed her bowsprit into splinters, so that for a moment she yawed wildly to port. Don Miguel swore profanely, and then, as the helm was put over to swing her back to her course, his own prow replied. But the aim was too high, and whilst one of the shots tore through the Arabella's shrouds and scarred her mainmast, the other again went wide. And when the smoke of that discharge had lifted, the English ship was found almost between the Spaniards, her bows in line with theirs, and coming steadily on into what his lordship deemed a death trap. Lord Julian held his breath, and Miss Bishop gasped, clutching the rail before her. She had a glimpse of the wickedly grinning face of Don Miguel, and the grinning faces of the men at the guns in the waist. At last the Arabella was right between the Spanish ships, prow to poop, and poop to prow. Don Miguel spoke to the trumpeter, who had mounted the quarter-deck and stood now at the admiral's elbow. The man raised the silver bugle that was to give the signal for the broadsides of both ships, but even as he placed it to his lips, the admiral seized his arm to arrest him. Only then had he perceived what was so obvious, or should have been to an experienced sea fighter. He had delayed too long, and Captain Blood had outmaneuvered him. In attempting to fire now upon the Englishman, the Milagrosa and her consort would also be firing into each other. Too late, he ordered the helmsman to put the tiller hard over and swing the ship to larboard, as a preliminary to maneuvering for a less impossible position of attack. At that very moment, the Arabella seemed to explode as she swept by. 18 guns from each of her flanks emptied themselves at that point-blank range into the hulls of the two Spanish vessels. Half stunned by that reverberating thunder, and thrown off her balance by the sudden lurch of the ship under her feet, Miss Bishop hurtled violently against Lord Julian, who kept his feet only by clutching the rail on which he had been leaning. Billowing clouds of smoke to starboard blotted out everything, and its acrid odor, taking them presently in the throat, set them gasping and coughing. From the grim confusion and turmoil in the waist below arose a clamor of fierce Spanish blasphemies and the screams of maimed men. The Milagrosa staggered slowly ahead, a gaping rent in her bulwarks. Her foremast was shattered, fragments of the yards hanging in the netting spread below. Her beak neck was in splinters, and a shot had smashed through into that great cabin, reducing it to wreckage. Don Miguel was bawling orders wildly, and peering ever and anon through the curtain of smoke that was drifting slowly astern in his anxiety to ascertain how it might have fared with the Hildaga. Suddenly, and ghostly at first through that lifting haze, loomed the outline of a ship. Gradually the lines of her red hull became more and more sharply defined as she swept nearer with poles all bare, save for the spread of canvas on her sprit. Instead of holding to her course as Don Miguel had expected she would, the Arabella had gone about under cover of the smoke, and sailing now in the same direction as the Milagrosa, was converging sharply upon her across the wind, so sharply that almost before the frenzied Don Miguel had realized the situation, his vessel staggered under the rending impact with which the other came hurtling alongside. There was a rattle and a clank of metal as a dozen grapnels fell and tore and caught in the timbers of the Milagrosa, and the Spaniard was firmly gripped in the tentacles of the English ship. Beyond her, and now well astern, the veil of smoke was rent at last, and the Hidalga was revealed in desperate case. She was bilging fast, with an ominous list to larboard. It could be no more than a question of moments before she settled down. The attention of her hands was being given entirely to desperate endeavor to launch the boats in time. Of this Don Miguel's anguished eyes had no more than a fleeting but comprehensive glimpse before his own decks were invaded by a wild, yelling swarm of boarders from the grappling ship. Never was confidence so quickly changed into despair. Never was hunger more swiftly converted into helpless prey. For helpless the Spaniards were. The swiftly executed boarding maneuver had caught them almost unawares in the moment of confusion following the punishing broadside they had sustained at such short range. For a moment there was a valiant effort by some of Don Miguel's officers to rally the men for a stand against these invaders, but the Spaniards, never at their best in close quarters fighting, were here demoralized by knowledge of the enemies with whom they had to deal. Their hastily formed ranks were smashed before they could be steadied, driven across the waist to the break of the poop on the other side, and up the forecastle bulkheads on the other. The fighting resolved itself into a series of skirmishes between groups, and whilst this was doing above, another horde of buccaneers swarmed through the hatch to the main deck below to overpower the gun crews at their stations there. On the quarter-deck, towards which an overwhelming wave of buccaneers was sweeping, led by a one-eyed giant who was naked to the waist, stood Don Miguel, numbed by the despair and rage. Above and behind him on the poop, Lord Julian and Miss Bishop looked on, his lordship aghast at the fury of this cooped-up fighting. The lady's brave calm conquered at last by horror, so that she reeled there, sick and faint. Soon, however, the rage of that brief fight was spent. They saw the banner of Castile come fluttering down from the masthead. A buccaneer had slashed the halyard with his cutlass. The boarders were in possession, and on the upper deck groups of disarmed Spaniards stood huddled now, like sheep. Suddenly Miss Bishop recovered from her nausea, to lean forward, staring wild-eyed, whilst if possible her cheeks turned yet a deadlier hue than had been already. Picking his way daintily through that shambles in the waist came a tall man with a deeply tanned face that was shaded by a Spanish headpiece. He was armed in back and breast of black steel, beautifully dascamened with golden arabesques. Over this, like a stole, he wore a sling of scarlet silk, from each end of which hung a silver-mounted pistol. Up the broad companion to the quarter-deck he came, toying with easy assurance, until he stood before the Spanish admiral. Then he bowed, stiff and formally. A crisp metallic voice, speaking perfect Spanish, reached those two spectators on the poop, and increased the admiring wonder in which Lord Julian had observed the man's approach. "We meet again at last, Don Miguel," it said. "I hope you are satisfied. Although the meeting may not be exactly as you pictured it, at least it has been very ardently sought and desired by you." Speechless, livid of face, his mouth distorted and his breathing labored, Don Miguel de Espinosa received the irony of that man to whom he attributed his ruin and more beside. Then he uttered an inarticulate cry of rage, and his hand swept to his sword. But even as his fingers closed upon the hilt, the others closed upon his wrist to rest the action. Calm, Don Miguel," he was quietly but firmly enjoined. "Do not recklessly invite the ugly extremes, such as you would, yourself, have practiced had the situation been reversed." A moment they stood looking into each other's eyes. "What do you intend by me?" the Spaniard inquired at last, his voice hoarse. Captain Blood shrugged. The firm lips smiled a little. "All that I intend has been already accomplished, and lest it increase your rancor, I beg you to observe that you have brought it entirely upon yourself. You would have it so. He turned and pointed to the boats which his men were heaving from the booms amidships. Your boats are being launched. You are at liberty to embark in them with your men before we scuttle the ship. Ronder the shores of Hispaniola. You should make them safely. And if you'll take my advice, sir, you'll not hunt me again. I think I am unlucky to you. Get home to Spain, Don Miguel, and to concerns that you understand better than this trade of the sea. For a long moment the defeated admiral continued to stare his hatred in silence. Then, still without speaking, he went down the companion, staggering like a drunken man, his useless rapier clattering behind him. His conqueror, who had not even troubled to disarm him, watched him go, then turned and faced those two immediately above him on the poop. Lord Julian might have observed, had he been less than taken up with other things, that this fellow seemed to suddenly to stiffen, and that he turned pale under his deep tan. A moment he stood at gaze, then suddenly and swiftly he came up the steps. Lord Julian stood forward to meet him. "You don't mean, sir, that you'll let that Spanish scoundrel go?" "Free!" he cried. The gentleman in the black corset appeared to become aware of his lordship for the first time. "And who the devil may you be?" he asked, with a marked Irish accent. "And what business may it be of yours at all?" His lordship conceived that the fellow's truculence and utter lack of proper deference must be corrected. "I am Lord Julian Wade," he announced, with that object. Apparently the announcement made no impression. "Are you indeed? Then perhaps you'll explain what the plague you're doing aboard this ship." Lord Julian controlled himself to afford the desired explanation. He did so shortly and impatiently. "He took you prisoner, did he, along with Miss Bishop here?" You are acquainted with Miss Bishop?" cried his lordship, passing from surprise to surprise. But this mannerless fellow had stepped past him, and was making a leg to the lady, who on her side remained unresponsive and forbidding at the point of scorn. Observing this, he turned to answer Lord Julian's question. "I had that honour once, but it seems that Miss Bishop has a shorter memory." His lips were twisted into a wry smile, and there was a pain in the blue eyes that gleamed so vividly under his black brows, pain bleeding with the mockery of his voice. But of all of this, it was the mockery alone that was perceived by Miss Bishop. She resented it. "I do not number thieves and pirates among my acquaintances, Captain Blood," said she, whereupon his lordship exploded in excitement. "Captain Blood!" he cried. "Are you Captain Blood?" "What else were you supposing?" Blood asked the question wearily, on his mind on other things. "I do not number thieves and pirates among my acquaintance." The cruel phrase filled his brain, re-echoing and reverberating there. But Lord Julian would not be denied. He caught him by the sleeve with one hand, and whilst with the other he pointed after the retreating, dejected figure of Don Miguel. Do I understand that you're not going to hang that Spanish scoundrel?" "What for should I be hanging him?" "Because he's just a damned pirate, as I have proved already." "Ah!" said Blood, and Lord Julian marvelled at the sudden haggardness of a countenance that had been so devil-may-care but a few moments since. "I am a damned pirate myself, and so I am merciful with my kind Don Miguel. Don Miguel goes free." Lord Julian gasped. "After what I've told you that he has done? After his sinking of the Royal Mary? After his treatment of me? Of us?" Lord Julian protested indignantly. "I am not in the service of England or of any other nation, sir, and I may not be concerned with any wrongs her flag may suffer." His lordship recoiled before the furious glance that blazed at him out of Blood's haggard face, but the passion faded as swiftly as it had arisen. It was in event. His lordship recoiled before that furious glance that blazed at him out of Blood's haggard face, but the passion faded as swiftly as it had risen. It was in a level voice that the captain added, "If you'll escort Miss Bishop aboard my ship, I shall be obliged to you. I beg that you'll make haste. We are about to scuttle this hulk." He turned slowly to depart, but again Lord Julian interposed. Containing his indignant amusement, his lordship delivered himself coldly. "Captain Blood, you disappoint me. I had hoped of great things for you." "Go to the devil," said Captain Blood, turning on his heel, and so departing. End of chapter 19.